Hello, welcome again to another episode of the Let Fuel Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to have on another freedom fighter and liberty warrior, someone who's really been looking at economic freedom, what's been happening in Poland for a number of years, and socialism, how it sucks. And so we've got a lot to talk about, and it's none other than Dr. Matt Mitchell. Matt, welcome to Let Fuel Prosper show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, the pleasure's mine. It's really a pleasure, and we've known each other for a number of years now, and you moved from different places, but it's always great to have you and talk to you about these key issues that we'll talk about today. For the audience, let me go ahead and read your bio, and then we'll jump right into it. So, Matt Mitchell is a senior fellow in the Center of Economic Freedom at the Fraser Institute. Prior to joining the Fraser Institute, Mitchell was a long-serving senior fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where he remains an affiliated senior scholar. He is also a senior research affiliate at the Knee Center for the Study of Occupational Regulation at West Virginia University. Great group over there, too. Mitchell received his PhD and MA in economics from George Mason University and his BA in political science and BS in economics from Arizona State University. His writing and research focus on economic freedom, public choice economics, and the economics of government favoritism. He has testified before the U.S. Congress and several state legislatures. He has advised federal, state, and local government policymakers in the United States on both fiscal and regulatory policy, and his research has been featured in numerous national outlets, including New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and others. So a lot of great work that you're doing, Matt, and I really appreciate being on the program. And so as I do with every guest, first question is, why do you do what you do each and every day?
Well, Vance, I grew up in New Mexico. I actually still live here. It's your neighbor to the west. New Mexico is sometimes called the sick man of the Southwest. You know, it's a beautiful state, rich culture, kind, good people. You know, it's one of the poorest states in the union. And with poverty comes other types of social maladies, everything from poor education to poor health. And yet, if you zoom out a little bit, New Mexico, if you compare it to our neighbor to the south, Mexico, it's significantly more prosperous. In fact, there's an interesting data set. If you look at, every year about 140,000 people immigrate from Mexico to the United States over the last several decades. Some subset of these people just moved from just south of the U.S.-Mexico border to just north of the U.S.-Mexico border. And what's interesting about this little case study is that these folks, if you think about the productivity, what goes into making some ability to produce, it's land, labor, and capital, right? Well, so here you have the exact same type of land, the exact same people, and you have differences in capital. So you could look at these differences in capital, and sure enough, there is more capital in New Mexico than Mexico. But it's not enough to explain the extraordinary difference in living standards that these folks enjoy when they immigrate just south of the U.S.-Mexico border to just north of the U.S.-Mexico border. So the typical person who makes that journey can increase their income 4.18 times. So, I mean, think about that. If you can just cross an imaginary line in the desert and the consumption of your family, the health care, the education, all the resources that that are available to you more than quadruple, a lot of us would do that. So this sort of like mystery is always stuck in my head, growing up in New Mexico. How is it that people just crossing a line are able to increase their incomes so much? And, the capital differences explain some of it, but not enough. That's really what got me into this, into the idea that, there's an extraordinary opportunity to improve people's lives if we can bring the same sort of prosperity that New Mexicans enjoy to Mexico, and even better, if we can bring the same sort of prosperity that Texans enjoy to New Mexico, the world can be a better place.
No, that's great, Matt, and it's part of the Let Fuel Prosper. I guess that that's what I do, and kind of my calling, I believe, is to continue to find ways to do that. That's why I was really excited to talk to you today, and I think there's a lot to dig into to what you just discussed. And before we get there, what's the Fraser Institute all about? I know you've been working there for a little while now, and what are you doing there?
So the Fraser Institute, it's actually one of the world's older think tanks. It was founded, I think that we're coming up on the 50th anniversary in 2024. Their mission, is to improve the lives of Canadians. Indirectly, this means, improving the lives of the whole world in the sense that if folks in Texas and New Mexico prosper, so do those in Canada. But one of their oldest projects, and it's the one really that I work on, is the Economic Freedom of the World project. And this originated in part out of discussions with Milton and Rose Friedman. The founder of the Fraser Institute is a man named Dr. Michael Walker. And Mike had this idea, we've got 200 years of economic theories from Adam Smith on down that suggest free people will be prosperous people. But, if you've ever spent time in a classroom and you talk to students about economic theory, one of the first things they say is, well, that's just theory. So I don't want to denigrate economic theory. I think it's very useful. But Mike's idea was let's try to put some data to it. If it is true that free people prosper, maybe we could measure freedom. And interestingly enough, I used to tell the story that he convinced Milton Friedman of this idea. Now that I've been at the Fraser Institute for about a year, I have a better understanding of the history. It turns out he convinced Rose Friedman. And Rose, is an empiricist herself, had done some important empirical work on poverty early in her career, and had always been sort of a partner with Milton in a lot of his work. And he convinced her, and then she convinced her husband, and then they really proselytized the idea. So in the early 90s, they held a series of conferences attended by, I think that there were 3 Nobel laureates in attendance: Gary Becker, Milton Friedman, Doug North, and then several other economic luminaries, Gordon Tullock, among others. And they, over the series of the conferences, they essentially refined the idea of trying to measure economic freedom, which, by the way, I just define as people have economic freedom when they are able to make their own economic choices without harming the like liberties of others. It's pretty simple. Do you have an ability to exchange, to purchase, to sell your labor, to form contracts, those types of things with other people? Really, the way they measure it is by looking at the degree to which governments impede that. So they look at the taxes that stop your ability, that limit your ability to exchange. They look at regulations that limit your ability to exchange. They look at international barriers to trade. They look at monetary policy, the degree to which governments promise that here's this piece of paper that we say has the full faith and credit of the United States. Will it maintain its value? And finally, they look at rule of law and property rights, the degree to which the contracts you enter are going to be protected. They have formulated this idea, and the first index came out in 1996. They've been publishing it every year since. Now the data actually go back all the way to the 1970s. So we have data now where we look at 165 jurisdictions across the world, use 45 different variables and assemble them into measures of economic freedom so that we can say, what are the most and least free countries in the world? And now the interesting thing is, now that you've got this idea of freedom, measuring freedom, it doesn't stop there. We then have an entire, field that has grown up in the wake of this index of academics who now use this index to study the effects of freedom. So there's a recent survey by one of the authors of the index. By the way, the index is authored by Jim Gwartney, Bob Lawson, and Ryan Murphy. And one of the authors, Bob Lawson, he did a survey of the literature last year, identified I think it's over 700 peer-reviewed academic studies looking at the effects of economic freedom on well-being. Everything from poverty and per capita GDP to conflicts and education and lifespan. And the overwhelming majority of this research finds, of course, as the theory predicted, go back to Milton Friedman's initial idea, Mike Walker's initial idea. We've got this theory that predicts people will prosper when they're free. And sure enough, the overwhelming empirical evidence suggests absolutely that's true.
Yeah, no, and it's great whenever the theory starts to match the data, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We have some proof that this can happen, and it's not just one or two. I mean, you talked about 700. This is overwhelming sort of look that you don't often get in academia or whatever we're trying to test at the end of the day. So that's great to hear, and I appreciate all the work that Fraser Institute's doing over the number of years. I've been going to the Economic Freedom of North America conference that they have in Dallas. I guess it's 2014. So it's been a while, and I really appreciate all the work of looking at economic freedom of the world. You also do the economic freedom of North America. That's one that I've used a lot in my research, digging into what's happening in Texas or Louisiana, or how does Texas compare with California? That's always a big divide there with the competition that's out there. And I think that's a big part of it, right? Is at least in the US, we have this laboratory of competition, but you also have kind of a laboratory of competition among the countries, among these 165 jurisdictions, as you put it. So this really gives us some good information to go on. Are there specific areas out of those many variables that you look at that you think are, I don't know, more prominent, a good place to start compared maybe with some of the others?
Yeah, absolutely. So empirically, the most important component of economic freedom, and this has been now found in a number of studies, is almost certainly the rule of law section. So if property and persons are not protected, it's very, very difficult for people to engage in economic activity. You need to be able to trust that the contracts that you form and that the property that you acquire are going to be protected. That's an extremely important area. Researchers have also found the regulatory component of economic freedom matters quite a bit, especially when it comes to barriers to starting businesses. And one aspect of this, by the way, there's a gender freedom subcomponent of economic freedom where Rosemarie Fike, another professor, does an adjustment to the Economic Freedom of the World Index and accounts for the fact that there's about 24 countries in the world that don't respect the economic freedom of women. So if you just look at, well, what's the general economic freedom of a man, you're not going to get the same type of answer. It's harder for women to start businesses, to own businesses, to acquire property in some of these countries. So those two really loom large: rule of law, protection of property, and regulations. But the other ones matter as well. Monetary policy matters, and you can sort of move down the scale to find. Interestingly enough, size of government is not as important a component of a determinant of well-being as we once thought. This isn't to say that it doesn't matter, but if we're being honest, regulatory barriers and property rights matter more than taxes, as it turns out.
Yeah, yeah. And that trust factor is so important, right? In a market economy where you have voluntary exchange, if you can't trust the person that you're exchanging with, it makes it more difficult. It hinders those transactions that are going to occur. And if we can't trust the government or the central bank in monetary policy, then that creates a whole other set of circumstances. We've seen some of that here in the U.S. here recently with inflation. Although it's moderating some, we have some disinflation now. But when inflation was 9% last year, real wages have been going down. People are like, what the heck's going on? And why is the government running such massive deficits, which can influence, the rule of law and other things that are going on. And we've seen kind of the rule of law being taken for granted in some of these cities in particular with, crime rates going back up again and some other things. And you wonder, well, what does this have to do with? Well, I think some of it's economic freedom, some of it's government and the input that's happening and the effects that inflation and everything else is having on our economy. Are those some of the things that you look at?
Yeah, absolutely. And what that highlights is the important sort of, it's a messy story here. It's not just economic freedom that matters. There's lots of other factors that matter as well. Geography matters to some extent, culture matters to a great extent. But interestingly enough, geography and culture and economic freedom are all intertwined in fascinating ways. So, you mentioned the idea of trust, and there's a large literature finding, that trust is a very important cultural aspect of economic prosperity. And if you think about, all the ways in which we sort of take trust for granted, you enter into agreements to, have somebody remodel your house, or you even walk into a restaurant and you can spend in the United States, you can spend $200 in a restaurant, and nobody's going to make you put up any kind of a bond ahead of time. You're allowed to eat all that food, and they just trust that you're going to pay in the end. Well, interestingly enough, trust, actually goes with economic freedom. As you have greater economic freedom, you tend to have greater trust. Geography is another interesting one. One of the ways that this tends to kind of go in both directions is we find, that certain geographic features, of course, can encourage prosperity. But also certain geographic features can encourage better institutions, better government rules. So, there's a sort of famous chapter in Guns, Germs, and Steel where Jared Diamond talks about how Europe has these mountains that are high enough to make it difficult for armies to cross, but low enough to make it possible for goods to cross. And, Adam Smith also talked about how Europe has all of these inlets, and, anywhere in Europe, you're not very far from water. Well, that makes it much easier to engage in exchange. You look at Africa, which has, amazingly enough, as large as Africa is, it does not have as many inlets. And so people are much further away from water, which means they're further away from, which means the transactions costs of exchanging with others are higher, and it makes it difficult to engage in economic activity. So the whole
Yep.
thing it's an interesting, there's lots of causal arrows going in all sorts of different directions.
There really are, Matt, and it's quite fascinating. It's one of the reasons why I love economics so much.
Yeah.
And I really got on, it took me a while to get to him, but Douglas North, I've learned a lot from Douglas North. I have a number of books over here in my bookshelf by him. If others, the audience, haven't read him yet, they should, because the importance of institutions, how institutions matter, and transactions cost. I had Michael Munger on recently, and he's all about transaction costs and brought that.
Yeah.
We've talked about that a lot, but then how that also is related to the rules of the game, where I've talked to Peter Boettke and Alex Salter about the rules of monetary policy and the constitutional rules of going back to Buchanan and Tullock and public choice economics. I think these things are so important and allows for more of that trust in those transactions that you were just talking about so eloquently to really come to life. And this is the part of economics that I think is often missed, especially in today's world, Matt. I mean, it seems like the government wants to be the first line of defense and everything, instead of where it should be as the last line of defense on things that are going on, and creating a lot of problems where too often we talk about, or some talk about market failures, but we forget about the government failures and the lack of knowledge of the top-down approaches that come in can really squander the economic activity, the innovation. We're seeing that with the FTC and antitrust laws right now and everything else. There's just so many factors. Even in the U.S., we haven't even got to the rest of the world in a lot of the problems that are going on. But in the U.S., we've got a lot of problems too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's something we need to continue to check out. And I was looking, at the Economic Freedom of the World, the 2022 annual report, and I guess the next one will be coming out later this year.
Yeah, pretty soon.
Yeah. So you have, Hong Kong is number 1, Singapore number 2, Switzerland number 3, New Zealand number 4, Denmark, Australia number 6, and U.S. number 7. We're 7th now, and it's been somewhere around there. We haven't been number 1 or number 2 in a while, if ever, on this report. And it's interesting how these kind of Nordic countries are those that are near the top. And people will usually say, well, it's because they're socialist countries, and that's why they have this, economic freedom and prosperity and everything else. But I think from your report and others that have been out there, that's not necessarily the case. What do you usually say about that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that are important here. One, by the way, so we have a new series called The Realities of Socialism. It's a series of publications in which we look at both real case studies of socialism. Poland is, I know, one that you and I are going to talk about here in a minute. We're also going to look at Estonia, but then also Denmark and Sweden. I didn't author these reports, or I only authored small portions of them. But these are case studies where these are actually not socialist countries. These are among some of the freest countries in the world, but they're often perceived as socialist. So the real story, and this is roughly true for both Sweden and Denmark, is that they have very long histories of limited government, really dating back to the 19th century. They have their own versions of Adam Smith, local intellectuals who had sort of proselytized the benefits of freedom, and they had internalized these lessons and had very small governments, few limited regulations, good and stable monetary policy, and excellent property rights. Now, in both cases, in the 1960s and 1970s, they departed from that model in mostly along one important dimension, and that was the dimension of size of government, which I mentioned earlier. As it turns out, it empirically is less important than rule of law and regulation and other aspects of economic freedom. It's not to say that it's not important, but it's just not as important as those others. And so they did greatly expand the size of government, very high taxes. In both cases, they basically went too far and encountered fiscal crises in the 1990s, where they had some combination of extremely high interest rates and extremely high inflation, and they really, in both cases, had to get their fiscal houses in order. Both countries reduced the size of government, reduced spending and taxes, and brought spending in line with taxation. Both governments managed to get their monetary policy back under control. And now, as it stands, both countries remain among the freest in terms of, again, monetary policy, regulatory policy, freedom to trade internationally, and rule of law, they still are outliers in terms of their size of government. But they seem to be able to make up for that to some degree with these other dimensions. Now, another important factor in both countries is that it's often perceived in North America that the way we could build a big generous welfare state is simply by taxing the rich. Well, in both of those countries, the tax burden, it's a very high tax rate, but it's borne by the middle class. It's the major tax instruments are the VAT tax and the personal income tax. And in both cases, the personal income tax, the top marginal tax rate actually kicks in at a very modest level, just a little bit above the median income. So it's really it's a shared burden in both of those countries. They also tend to have pretty low corporate income tax rates. So the idea is, come here, your business will not be taxed extremely high. The average person will have a fairly high tax rate, but they'll also enjoy a low regulatory burden and an ease of starting businesses. And that's kind of the model that they've adopted.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think that people just don't quite understand exactly what their system's like. They see it from a distance and they've heard a couple things, so they think that it's a socialist country and everything. And it's like, no, hold on, press the brakes a little bit. That's not quite right. If you do look at the countries that are more socialist, like Venezuela, they're at the bottom. They rank 165th here. Sudan, Zimbabwe, those are the ones. Argentina is down there as well. Those are some of the countries that you have bigger government. Iraq is near the bottom. So you have a lot of those that are right near the bottom where you would expect, given the situation that they're in and everything else. And even when you look at the economic freedom of North America, you have those states that you would expect to be at the top. You've got your Florida, New Hampshire, Tennessee, Texas, those types of states without a personal income tax, for one thing, but also lower regulatory environment, less government spending. Some of the key things that I think helps them to prosper, and people keep moving to those places. And still in Texas, Matt, we've got about 1,000 people a day on average that are moving to Texas. And so there's a lot of demand, and people vote with their feet. And so they're moving to these places like Texas and Florida and Tennessee. Whereas at the bottom, at the end of the economic freedom index scale there, rankings, I should say, you have New York and California. They're right near the end because of some of the bigger government and regulatory system where people are, fleeing. Illinois being another one. I saw in New Mexico, what were they? They were like 43rd in the latest report where you're at. So, it tells us a lot about, and again, going back to this, is that it allows for competition and what works, what doesn't work, and things of that nature. And so these institutions really matter. And so moving on now to your work on Poland, which you've done some great work on this. There's the latest study, which I'll make sure it's in the show notes. I'll do with the economic freedom reports as well. Put those in the show notes at vanceginn.substack.com. But the Road to Socialism and Back, an economic history of Poland, 1939 to 2019. So what's up with Poland? What's going on there?
So, Poland's a fascinating country. You may have heard just a couple of weeks ago, somebody did an estimate where they were looking at Poland's growth rate, and they projected, it's not if trends continue, it won't be long until Poland actually their per capita GDP exceeds that of the United Kingdom.
Wow.
Now, this probably would have been, just inconceivable a few decades ago. But, here's basically the story of Poland. This is a country with a proud and long history. Unfortunately, a good portion of that history has been, it's been under the heel of one empire or another. So starting in 1939, the Soviet Union made a pact with the National Socialists of Germany. And it's the famous Soviet Nazi Pact. Under that agreement, in September 1939, Germany invades Poland from the west, and then the USSR invades Poland from the east. They actually have a joint Nazi-Soviet parade in celebration of their conquest of Poland, and they occupy it, very brutal occupation. And then eventually, in a couple years, Hitler turns on his erstwhile ally Stalin and invades the Soviet Union. So then there's more fighting, and Stalin has to then reinvade Poland and eventually kicks the Germans out, and they create a socialist state in Poland. And we often use this term experiment to describe the socialist experiment in the mid 20th century. I'm reluctant to use the term because it to some degree, glosses over the fact that we're talking about humans here. This isn't just some kind of a, laboratory where you can, add a little bit of this and a little bit of that and see what happens. But that's in some ways the way that the socialists, saw it. Adam Smith has this great quote, talking about the man of system, presumes that he can rearrange the pieces of society like they're pieces of a chessboard, not thinking that these people have their own thoughts and desires and wishes. And that's very much the way that the socialists, saw it. So for the next 4 decades, the socialist experiment was allowed to play out in Poland. And the extraordinary thing about it is that if you evaluate it from the perspective of Marx, almost every one of Marx's predictions were 100% true. All you need to do is replace the word capitalism with socialism. Marx predicted impoverishment. Socialism impoverished the people of Poland. Marx predicted alienation, that people would, lose faith in one another and in their institutions. That's exactly what happened with socialist Poland. Marx predicted commodification, that capitalism would lead people to be obsessed with material things. That's exactly what happened in socialist Poland. If you don't have access to bread and meat and chocolate, then you start to view all of your relationships as, means to that end. And so you have stories of people we have many quotes in the book about this, people saying, when did I become, this sort of monster where I'm just seeing all my friends and colleagues and loved ones as means to an end to try to, survive. Marx predicted that there would be, of course, famously predicted that there would be a revolt, that the people would rise up in mass and revolt. Well, true socialism was imposed from the outside. The real revolt came against socialism when the workers rose up. So there's a beautiful story. It's got a tragic ending of a young woman who had previously, she had been considered a shock worker, which was the socialist. Basically, it would identify people who were extraordinarily hard workers, and they would praise them. The idea was to try to drive and push everybody else to produce. And that's another aspect, by the way. Marx predicted that capitalists would just try to squeeze as much as they can out of workers. That's exactly what the socialist regime did. Imprison people for taking more than 4 days off of work. Just had an obsession with outproducing the West. So anyway, this woman had been previously praised by the communists, but she had a very strong sense of social justice, and she saw one of her bosses steal from the company retirement fund, and so she did the right thing. She reported it to the socialist authorities, and she presumed, that she would be rewarded. Well, in fact, she was fired, and this was in the Gance shipyard. And she was such a well-liked colleague that there was a massive strike. All of her colleagues came to her defense. And what ended up happening is this really was the beginning of the end of socialism, because this mass strike led to the formation of the solidarity movement. It's incredible to think about the numbers. At one point, there were 10 million Poles that were part of this movement. This was the first independent trade union. It wasn't part of the communist regime. The first independent trade union in all of the socialist world. There were 10 million members. There's only 30 million people in Poland at the time.
Wow.
So 1 in 3 people were members of this union. They rose up in protest. It also helped, by the way, that there was a new Catholic Pope who happened to be Polish. He came and visited Poland, and he told his fellow countrymen, be not afraid. And with those words, sort of gave them the courage to stand up. In the long December night of 1981, there was a brutal crackdown on the leaders of Solidarity. And the movement was sort of pushed underground for about 5 or 6 years. But this really was, when they came for the leader of the movement, Lech Walesa, he said, "This is the last nail in the coffin for you. Communism is done." And he ended up being right. You had to wait till the end of the decade to finally see it realized. But sure enough, communism fell, and it fell because of the worker revolution. Again, go back to the idea that Marx had, that workers were going to rise up, and sure enough, they rose up, but they rose up against the workers' regime rather than against capitalism. And then one last little footnote coda on the story, which is sad. The woman who started this all, her name is Anna Novitz. Hopefully I pronounced that right. You may remember a few years ago, there was a tragic plane crash. I think it was about 2010, in which several Polish dignitaries, including the Prime Minister of Poland, was killed. She was on that plane. They were going to commemorate the Katyn massacre, which was a terrible incident in which the Soviets murdered about 15,000 Polish prisoners of war, officers from the Polish army, and covered it up and didn't acknowledge it for the next several decades, in fact. So in some ways, she was the very last victim of communism.
Wow.
That's a tragic story.
That really is. Yeah, I didn't realize that. I didn't know. That's something else. Well, I'm glad she did what she did, getting everything started, though. And you're right. That's quite fascinating, though, to put it in terms of Karl Marx, who talked about the proletariats overthrowing the bourgeoisie and having this conflict going on. But you have that same sort of thing happen, but overthrowing socialist communist governments.
Right. One other, important aspect about this, and one of the things that's so appealing, I think, to young people about communism is the idea of equality.
Yeah.
That too, he was absolutely correct. If you just replace the words socialism with capitalism, there's extraordinary inequality in socialist Poland. So not only in terms of there were income disparities, but a lot of it was just in the sort of off-books privileges. So if you were a member of what was called the nomenklatura, these were the elite, the top party leaders, the top planners in the government, you didn't have to deal with the privations that everybody else had to. There was rampant shortages. Poles had to wait 3 decades for housing. Not if you were a member of the nomenklatura. There were shortages of meat. Not if you were a member of the nomenklatura. You could shop in your own specially designated, shops. You were able to hunt in your own hunting grounds, go to your own spas. You had your own health care that was a different, better system. You didn't pay taxes. That part, by the way, was kept as a state secret because they felt that would be undermines the socialist project if people found out that the members of the nomenklatura didn't have to pay taxes. So even down to the most appealing aspect of socialism, which is equality, even that was absent in socialist Poland. Okay, sorry, go on.
Wow. No, this is great. No, this is really good. And one of the issues, right? Because I guess socialism is usually defined as the means of production are owned by government versus capitalism, the means of production's owned by individuals. And so you allow for, again, that trust that we were talking about earlier, Matt. I mean, in socialism, you don't really trust each other. There's not prices that are allocating resources. It's this top-down approach. It's the underground economy. It's the not paying taxes. It's the quote-unquote fringe benefits that are going on compared to kind of the profit or loss system that we see in capitalism. Is that kind of where you kind of see the divide, or one of the divides?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's also important to think in terms of a continuum too. Even within the socialist experiment, there were varying degrees of state control. So you may have heard of Lenin's departure from socialism early on. It's called the NEP, the New Economic Plan. If initially they didn't want there to be any money prices, they wanted everything to be controlled, and it was just an absolute disaster. And so he departed from that and permitted some degree private economic activity and some degree of privately set prices. And then Stalin, when he came on, sort of reversed that and wanted to go back to a much stronger version of socialism and introduced the 5-year plans. So you can see this continuum where when freedom was especially limited before the NEP, things were disastrous. Once the NEP came into effect, Soviet Russia managed to grow a little bit. Then once the 5-year plan is instituted, it goes back. Stalin, of course, one of the absolute worst disasters was the collectivization of agriculture. And the Ukrainians know this story more than anybody else. by some measures, one of the worst famines in the 20th century. I think it's only bested, bested is a terrible word, but it's only outdone by Mao's disastrous collectivization and 30 million people dying in China. But so you can thinking in terms of a continuum, I think, is pretty helpful because it's this idea. There's a degree to which the state can control your activity. And even in socialist Poland, one thing that was interesting is relatively early, they actually abandoned the idea of collectivizing farms. And this was unique in Poland. Other aspects of the other parts of the socialist world did not have private farming activity, but they did permit that in Poland, and they also permitted small shops to be privately owned. Yeah, I think means of control is important, but then just thinking in terms of a continuum is also valuable.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I think you're exactly right. And one thing I was going to say earlier on the economic freedom of the world, so Poland currently, I guess, or at least 2020, the latest data that was available, ranked 80th in the world. But if you go back, I was looking at the chart because I have this chart on page 144. It talks about in 1980, rank was 46th, but in 1990 was 105th, 2000 79th. So I guess that's where you started seeing some of those changes take place that you just talked about. 2010 was 81st, then 61st, 71st, and 2019. So 61st was in 2015, 2019, 71st, and then 80th in 2020. Now, of course, these are relative rankings, so there could be some small changes in some of the scores that y'all use to move these around, but you certainly saw a huge change, kind of the institutional changes that we were talking about earlier, from 1980 at 46th to 105th in 1990 to 79th in 2000. Those are pretty wild changes, right?
Well, that's true. And the other thing, these are relative changes in the sense that you have to think about what's the rest of the world doing. And really, the reality is for much of this time period, the whole rest of the world was growing freer as well. So in the U.S., we've been in a slow decline in economic freedom since about 2000. But globally, economic freedom just has continued to rise up through 2019. Big reversal in the last 2 years, 2020 and 2021, with COVID. But otherwise, the world has basically, most countries around the world have been liberalizing in the sense of deregulating, making property rights more secure, cutting taxes. And in some ways, Poland really just has lost some momentum in their reforms. They had pretty significant reforms in the 1990s and just haven't kept that up in the 2000s and later.
Yeah, no, great point there. I think it gives us a lot to think about also in the U.S. to make sure that we're not heading in the wrong direction, which we seem to be in some sense, but we got to make sure we have those pro-growth policies. That's basically getting government out of the way to allow for people to prosper and have more liberty and everything else. And so Matt, as we're wrapping up here, first of all, say anything else that you'd like to say about this, but also what makes you kind of optimistic about the future that we will prosper and that there's going to be more prosperity, or are we kind of in a dire situation? I've had some people go different ways, so I wonder what you say about that.
Well, I'm a little bit of two minds of this. So on the one hand, I think like you, I'm a student of public choice, and public choice tends to make one a little bit skeptical and a little bit maybe depressed, because it just shows you that there's a lot of strong incentives working against liberalization. And the basic idea here is that, small, organized, concentrated interests can gain from obtaining policies that privilege them at the expense of the public. So this could be anything from barriers to entry in their business to subsidies to transfers. And so those types of policies, there is the political system is sort of geared towards favoring those groups and these policies. And that can make one depressed. But one of the reasons why I study, economic freedom is because if you zoom out and you take a bigger picture, both globally and over time, you can't help but be, I think, pretty optimistic. The truth is that we do manage to overcome a lot of these public choice problems over time. As I mentioned earlier, globally, economic freedom has been on the rise, pretty much steadily for 3 decades. We've seen a setback in COVID, but I would predict that will be erased soon. And I think one reason for this is competition. The next job or the next investment that's made, it could be made in Texas or New Mexico or Poland or Estonia. And businesses and people are more mobile than ever, and governments that ignore that do so at their peril. And so I think that rise of global competition between governments is really what makes has sort of advanced economic freedom over the long run, and I don't see any reason to believe that it's going to stop advancing over the next several decades.
Well, those are helpful comments. I think hopefully that will give some optimism to the listeners, as you know, I think we have some cautious optimism as we move forward and make sure that we learn from the past and allow for markets to work where competition brings about the better outcomes for folks, which is what you've been working on for a long time, and what the Fraser Institute and others are working on. So thank you for all you're doing. And, God bless you, Matt, for you and your family. And thank you for being on the Let People Prosper show.
Thanks, Vance. And the same to you. It's a pleasure chatting with you, and it's great to see you.
Yeah, you too. And for the audience, please go out and give us a 5-star rating if you like this show, and share with your friends and family. And until next time, let people prosper.